Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Vulfpeck called Hill Climber. So here's something a little bit alarming about my job as a critic, and I'll walk you through the scenario that I faced. Say you're given a band, primarily promoted through Bandcamp, so you're going to assume they're a small to mid-size act, and you never heard of them. Well, it's fine enough. That's not uncommon if they're a step outside the mainstream, or they've never gotten Pitchfork or Quietus coverage. So you start digging through their back catalog, only to discover that this band might be a lot bigger than you could have possibly expected, with collaborations with named critical darlings in their scene, and a social media presence that might actually guarantee an audience for my review, made all the more awkward by the fact that you really did not like what you heard going through that entire back catalog. And yeah, that was my experience with Vulfpeck, an American funk act who broke out in the 2010s and been quietly pumping out albums throughout the course of this decade. And you know, when you see that list of session players they worked with in funk, it's a little bit astonishing that I had not heard about this band sooner. Indeed, I can imagine some of the audiences might be more familiar with how they were backing Darren Criss on his 2013 tour than the fact that they worked with Bootsy Collins, Bernard Purdie, and David T. Walker. But as a music critic, when I see that sort of thing, I perk up. But of course, if you're in the music industry, you probably know about this band for having trolled Spotify back in 2014 by putting an entirely silent album online in order to gain the streaming service, which actually got them about $20,000 before the album got pulled. But in all due honesty, there are points I'd probably prefer to listen to that than some of their larger recorded output. Yeah, this is where things get a little awkward, because I would struggle to say that I'm a fan of Vulfpeck at all. Limp production, underwhelming vocals unless they pulled up a credible guest star, and generally pretty embarrassing lyrics that might wind up as some of the most safe and sterile and, let's be honest, white attempts at funk that I've heard in a long time. Yeah, the playing can be very good, but with no edge or intensity or greater sense of texture, it just got really grating for me very fast. And when you couple up their social media presence, it makes it hard to tell if they're a joke act that just so happens to have a few ringers who can play really well. Well, I gotta be honest, it's not the sort of act I really feel the need to cover on this show. Now, that being said, they slowed things down significantly for their album last year. It was just more limp and boring than actively grating like The Beautiful Game was, but at least it was tolerable, especially with some of the vocal guest stars they called up. But this new album, it's gotten some good reception, so alright, what the hell? What do we get out of Hill Climber? Honestly, I have no idea what anybody really wants me to say here. It's another Vulfpeck album. I'm not a fan of it, and the only reason I'm covering it here on my show instead of on The Trailing Edge is because I'd like to use it as an object lesson surrounding what I personally like to hear in my funk music, especially when it's a group that is as well connected and savvy of players as these guys are. That said, while I will not say that I really enjoyed this project much at all, I will say its second half was measurably more tolerable than the first. Not really enough to make it passable, but it gets close enough at points that I can see why some people might like this and why they do have something of an audience. So alright, let's deal with the first obvious issue and why I really could not stand the first half of this album, Theo Katzman's vocals. And what's annoying is that I know exactly what he's trying to do here. He doesn't have the timbre or raw firepower to deliver funk with some actual bite to it, so he's opting for some thinner, quivering, overdubbed crooning. Already a dangerous route given how much I like my funk to have some soul in it, and this is a considerable step away from that, but okay, I'm rolling with it. But what becomes abundantly clear is that he just does not have the tightness or force of charisma in his delivery to really grab my ear. His tone is so reedy and limp. His attempts at sensuality are painfully underwhelming, even with the multi-tracking. And what's worse is how it carries the thinness of someone who either won't commit to his delivery out of ironic detachment, or can't commit and thus should not be behind the microphone at all. And while I won't say that Mike Viola's guest performance is much better on Forced Survival, more a factor of bad production choices and lyrics and being a lousy song as a whole, he's at least got a little bit of rasp and texture in his voice and his crooning to make it stick for me, even if he's stuck singing opposite what sounds like a country slide guitar timbre and the same sanitized but awkward peppiness that I have never liked about Vulfpeck. And while I'm in this territory, the lyrics continue to be pretty bad too, mostly a factor of our frontman delivering them with the sort of underwhelming lack of charisma to feel remotely convincing. Chromeo overselling this, or even Bruno Mars overselling it? This is not. Mostly they just come across as kind of bland, Land, half of the way springs to mind. Or really stupid, the overloaded animal references on Darwin Derby are a hell of a lot less funny than anybody thinks this is. There's a lot of just try-hard white guy weirdness, and take it from somebody who knows that, I will call it out. But believe it or not, they actually get worse. Take Lonely Town, which is about the sort of post-breakup blues that might have had pathos if it wasn't delivered with the sort of theatrical vaudeville cadence and language that demands some character, and certainly not those unfortunate stabs at falsetto that really don't sound good. Then opposite what it could have been a drippy Michael Bublé instrumental on Love is a Beautiful Thing, we get this noxious bit of jealousy where he professes love isn't so beautiful when it's with her and somebody else. And not only is it nowhere close to being as slick or soulful to make this sort of song work, look up Kyle Craft's Slick and Delta Queen if you want the prime example of how to do this right this year, but there's no joke here in order to make the subversion stick, and nothing from this Mike Posner wannabe in order to sell it properly. Then there's For Survival, the sort of love me because the world is ending song that I have long found tiresome, especially this year, but it hits the weird spot with its language choices and how our protagonist wants to be packaged for survival that it's not outrageous enough to be funny, but it's too slapdash to feel all that sincere. It's just wonky and cringeworthy, and not in a way that can be even enjoyed all that ironically, so I don't know why anybody likes the writing here. Now thankfully, the second half of this project is all instrumental, and simply getting rid of the bad writing and the vocals does make a measurable uptick, but this is where we get into my other big issue with Vulfpeck, and really what's prevented me from liking them their entire career: the production and the arrangements. Now, I'll fully admit that I got more of a funk rock or funk metal preference when it comes to this style of music and groove. I like there to be a little bit more fire in the arrangement, but since Vulfpeck have opted for the sort of low-key, loungy funk that's more about the jam and the vibes, it's not really on the table. Fine, I can get into that. But there is a way of capturing that tone without sounding so chintzy and limp as all hell, and it's hard for me not to just blame some of the production here. I get that their brand of record is stripped back and minimal, is actively trying to produce that live sound in their recording to highlight some virtuoso playing, but that approach only works best when you're trying to amp up some level of intensity, or you're going to subtly emphasize specific elements in the mix for showy solos with some subtler production, or, do something interesting within the mastering process to add some distinctive texture or depth to the mix to give it some sort of swell or presence. And given that Vulfpeck aren't really doing any of this, it leads to a lot of mixes that wind up lacking a lot of character or dynamics to cultivate anything beyond the most minimal chintzy tones, especially in a lot of the keyboards that can slip towards some utterly limp organ embellishments on Lonely Town that clash really awkwardly with the acoustic groove, or they just sound drippy as all hell on Love is a Beautiful Thing. And that's not counting on all the jaunty melodies punching into Darwin Derby or For Survival that really don't work at all, especially with that funkier groove. It sounds really peppy in a weird way. And things sadly don't get much better when you get the rubbery tones of Soft Parade, or the incredibly stiff clash between the tinny acoustic line on Disco Ulysses with a stronger bass, or how clicking and lacking in body the acoustics and pianos on the Cup Stacker can feel, especially with a bass line that feels that fat and rich. Hell, the mix only really came alive for me with It Gets Funkier 4, and even then, for as much as I respected the shred here, the keys and acoustics sound chopped to ribbons and not really allowed to pick up on much of anything. I guess if I'm going to compliment them on anything here, it's that bass can indeed feel pretty funky, and the percussion lines actually have a surprising amount of character and tonal richness, but if anything, that highlights how competent mixing or a better tonal choice could lead to a much more interesting project overall, because at the end of the day, it's just not all that catchy and doesn't really click for me. So on some level, look, I'm walking away from this album a bit at a loss. It's got the raw components of a decent funk album, minus the vocals or the lyrics, but let's be honest, a lot of funk doesn't always have that either. But it feels way too jittery or stiff to cultivate a solid vibe, lacking any of the soul or raw edge that can make for a fiery performance, and even much of the progressive chops in song structure, tone, or dynamics to get truly challenging in this lane. What it's more evidence of is that if the playing is good, and let me stress this, these guys can play, and a good online gimmick can surface, people will just get behind anything, even if you're not assembling any particularly good songs as a whole. If anything, it feels like more like extremely talented studio craftsmen trying to assemble something that should come together more organically, and yet without quite enough structural skills to get the components to truly click for better overall component songs. And thus, while I absolutely imagine that this will play better live, I'm giving it a strong 4 out of 10, and I really can't recommend it. Well, let me put it like this. When Charlie Puth can deliver more interesting and visceral funk music than you do, you might have a problem. But you know what? They've got their audience. My only question will happen when that audience realizes that the hill that they're climbing, it'll never translate into a proper mountain. And going downhill from that, you never know what's going to happen. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm actually a little bit surprised I had this much to say about this album, but again, it's Vulfpeck, and again, they're not for me. I'm not a fan. If you're more of a fan, polls there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. If you want to buy or stream it, links in the description below. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. If you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.